My name is Jack, and I am the proprietor of Solitude Peak Cabins. This is not a title of vanity, but a statement of fact, a definition of a role I have occupied for more of my life than I have not. My professional capacity is to provide a curated experience of isolation for those who seek it, and a degree of safety for those who do not understand what they have sought. The property is located deep within the Colorado Rockies, a place where the cartographer's pen strokes become hesitant, then stop altogether. To reach us, you must navigate a single, unpaved road that winds through aspen groves and skirts the edges of chasms for 12 miles past the last sign of civilization. In winter, this road is often a theoretical concept, a memory buried under feet of snow. The cabins themselves, 3 in total, though only one is ever rented to a single party at a time, are sturdy structures of reclaimed timber and native stone, built to withstand the geologic temper of the mountains. They sit in a small, sheltered bowl on the shoulder of the peak, surrounded by a silent congregation of lodgepole pines. From the porch of the main cabin, one can see across the valley to the jagged, indifferent spine of the continent. It is a view of sublime, almost aggressive beauty, the kind of beauty that reminds you of your own insignificance, the fleeting nature of your warmth and your breath. The mountains do not care if you live or die. They were here long before you, and they will remain long after your bones are dust. This is the primary truth of this place, and the sooner a guest understands it, the better. My newest guest, a writer named Alex, arrived today. He drove a sensible all-wheel drive vehicle that was already dusted with the first flakes of the coming storm. He was a man in his late 30s, with the soft hands of a city dweller, and a look in his eyes I recognized well, a mixture of creative desperation and the naive belief that solitude is a gentle muse. He thought he was escaping the noise of his world. He did not yet understand that he was trading it for a silence that is far more demanding. "It's incredible," he said, his breath pluming in the frigid air as he stared at the panorama. "Even more dramatic than the pictures." "The pictures don't capture the scale," I replied, my tone even and professional. "Or the quiet." I helped him with his luggage, a laptop bag and 2 oversized duffels, the typical arsenal of a writer on a deadline. The air was already thick with the promise of a blizzard, the sky a bruised, heavy gray. The wind was beginning to pick up, a low moan that would soon become a shriek. As we stepped inside the main cabin, the sudden warmth and the scent of pine and wood smoke seemed to envelop us, a fragile pocket of domesticity carved out of the immense wilderness. The cabin was well appointed, with a large stone fireplace, comfortable furniture, and a kitchen stocked with basic provisions. A large picture window dominated the main wall, currently framing the swirling snow as a piece of kinetic art. "This is perfect," Alex said, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "Exactly what I needed. No distractions, no neighbors. Just this." "The distractions here are of a different nature," I said, setting his bags down. "Which brings me to the tenancy agreement." From a drawer in the heavy oak desk that sat in the corner, I retrieved a single, laminated card. It was thick, the edges worn smooth from years of use. The text was printed in a simple, clear font under a formal heading. I handed it to him. "This is the guest tenancy and safety addendum," I explained. "It's imperative that you read it and abide by it. The rules are not suggestions. They are conditions of your stay." He took the card, his smile faltering slightly into a look of bemused curiosity. He clearly expected a list of checkout times and Wi-Fi passwords. What he read was something else entirely, Solitude Peak Cabin's guest tenancy and safety addendum. Welcome to Solitude Peak. For your safety and comfort during your stay, the following rules must be strictly observed. Non-compliance will result in the immediate termination of your tenancy. 1. Curfew of the census. Between the hours of 11 p.m. and 6 a.m., all curtains must be fully drawn and secured. No light should be visible from the outside. Furthermore, no music or audio of any kind should be played at a volume audible beyond the cabin walls during this period. Reason provided: this is to respect the nocturnal patterns of local wildlife and to preserve the natural darkness of the environment from light pollution. 2. The offering. All organic food waste of fruit peels, vegetable scraps, coffee grounds, meat bones, etc. must be collected throughout the day. Before sunset, this waste must be placed within the small, cast iron box located on the back porch. The lid must be secured. Never leave organic waste inside the cabin overnight. Reason provided: this protocol prevents the attraction of bears, mountain lions, and other potentially dangerous scavengers to the immediate vicinity of the cabins. 3. The silence of 3. Should you hear 3 distinct, sharp, and evenly spaced knocks on any door or window, you are to ignore them. Do not answer the door. Do not call out. Do not look through the peephole or part the curtains. Acknowledge the sound in no way. It is the wind. In this part of the mountains, it is always the wind. Reason provided: the unique topography and high altitude pressure systems can create unusual acoustic phenomena that mimic deliberate sounds. Reacting to them is unnecessary. 4. Mirror discipline. After dusk has fallen, you must not gaze at your own reflection in any mirrored surface, a bathroom mirror, window panes, dark screens for more than 60 seconds at a time. If you must use a mirror, be brief and deliberate. Reason provided: mild symptoms of altitude sickness can include dizziness and minor visual distortions. Prolonged self-focus in a reflection can exacerbate these feelings and lead to disorientation. 5. The path is absolute. Under no circumstances are you to stray from the clearly marked gravel paths that connect the cabins and lead to the woodshed. This is especially critical after the first significant snowfall, which can obscure treacherous terrain, hidden crevices, and unstable ground. Reason provided: standard wilderness safety protocol to prevent falls, injury, and becoming lost. Alex finished reading and looked up at me, a quizzical eyebrow raised. The professional smile he had adopted was gone, replaced by a look of genuine puzzlement. He was trying to decide if this was a joke, an elaborate piece of local color for the tourists. "This is very specific," he said, tapping the laminated card with his index finger. "The knocking rule, the mirror thing. You get a lot of nervous city folk up here. I get guests who are unaccustomed to this environment," I replied, my voice betraying no emotion. "The rules are the result of a long and difficult process of learning how to coexist with this place. They are not for my benefit, Mr. Henderson. They are for yours." My formality seemed to disarm his skepticism, at least for a moment. He saw no wink, no hint of a jest in my expression. He saw only a quiet, wary seriousness. He shrugged, placing the card on the mantelpiece of the fireplace. "All right then," he said, forcing a lighter tone. "When in Rome. Curtains closed, trash out, ignore the wind, and no staring contests with myself." "Got it." I gave him a final, curt nod. "I reside in the caretaker's cabin, the one furthest down the path. The generator is reliable, but should it fail, there are lanterns and matches in the kitchen pantry. I will check on you tomorrow morning. Enjoy the quiet." With that, I left him to settle in. As I walked back to my own cabin, the snow was falling in thick, wet flakes, already beginning to cling to my coat. The wind was a living thing in the pines, whispering secrets I had learned long ago not to hear. I did not look back. The first 2 days passed without incident. The storm was relentless, burying the landscape in a deep, sound-dampening blanket of white. The road was impassable. Alex was completely, utterly cut off from the world, just as he'd wanted. I saw the light from his cabin in the evenings, a warm, defiant glow against the vast, encroaching dark. I imagined him at the oak desk, words pouring from his fingertips, fueled by the profound isolation. He was a man in a bottle, and the mountain was the sea. On the third night, the storm broke. The clouds tore themselves apart to reveal a sky of impossible clarity, littered with the cold, sharp diamonds of a billion stars. A full moon, huge and luminous at this altitude, rose over the peaks, bathing the snow-covered world in a sterile, blue, white light. It was a beautiful and therefore dangerous night. Inside his cabin, Alex would have been working. I could picture him, deep in his narrative, the fictional world more real to him than the one outside his window. He would have felt the pull of that moonlight, the desire to see it, to experience the vista he had paid for. The rules, which had likely seemed so strange and arbitrary in the warmth of the cabin, would have felt like foolish superstitions under the spell of that lunar glow. It is the nature of the rational mind to test its boundaries, to push against the illogical. It is a trait that has allowed humanity to build cities and map the stars. Here, it is a fatal flaw. I was banking the fire in my own cabin when I felt it. A subtle shift in the atmosphere, a change in the texture of the silence. It was a feeling I had come to know with an intimacy that bordered on dread. A wire had been tripped. A line had been crossed. A small, seemingly insignificant invitation had been extended. Later, much later, Alex would tell me what he did. He had been working late, well past midnight. He'd gotten up to stretch, and through a tiny gap in the curtains of the great picture window, he saw the moonlit landscape. It was, he said, the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He hesitated for only a moment, thinking of my strange list of rules. Then he scoffed at his own timidity. It was just a view. What harm could it do? He pulled one of the heavy curtains back, just a foot or so, leaving a sliver of the world visible. He stood there for a few minutes, mesmerized, before returning to his work, leaving the gap as it was. He noticed nothing at first. The night remained silent, save for the occasional groan of a snow-laden pine branch. He finished his chapter, feeling a surge of creative triumph. He made a cup of tea, the familiar ritual of comfort in the vast emptiness. It was as he was rinsing his mug in the sink that he heard it. 3 sharp, distinct knocks on the window pane directly above the sink. Tap. 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 They were not loud, but they were precise, unmistakable. They were not the random rattling of a branch or the percussive effect of the wind. They were measured, patient, and intelligent. He froze, the mug still in his hand. His heart hammered against his ribs. His first thought, a panicked, primal one, was that I had come to check on him, that I had seen the light in the gapped curtain and was angry. But that made no sense. My cabin was 100 yards away, and the snow was waist deep. And why would I knock on the window like that, instead of the door? Then he remembered the rule. It is the wind. It is always the wind. He stood there for a long time, his back to the window, every muscle tensed. He was a rational man, an educated man. He did not believe in ghosts or mountain spirits. It was the wind, a strange acoustic trick, nothing more. He repeated it to himself, a mantra against the fear that was coiling in his stomach. He forced himself to move. He placed the mug in the dish rack, his movements stiff and jerky. He did not turn around. He did not look. He walked out of the kitchen, his eyes fixed straight ahead, and went directly to the picture window. With a trembling hand, he pulled the curtain shut, securing it tightly. He then went around the cabin, checking every other window, ensuring each was completely obscured. Only then did he go to bed, pulling the covers up to his chin like a child. He lay awake for hours, listening to the profound silence, a silence that now felt less like peace and more like a held breath. He had followed the rule, but he knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that something was now aware of him. The silence was listening. Alex awoke to a world of blinding white and aching silence. Sunlight, sharp and undiluted at this altitude, streamed through a tiny gap he'd missed in the curtains, painting a brilliant stripe across the wooden floor. He had slept, but it was the shallow, fitful sleep of the hunted, leaving him more exhausted than rested. His neck was stiff, his eyes gritty. For a moment, he lay perfectly still, listening. The cabin was quiet. The mountain was quiet. The memory of the 3 sharp taps on the window felt distant, like the fading logic of a dream. He swung his legs out of bed, the cold floorboards shocking him into a more solid reality. He was a writer, he reminded himself as he started the coffee maker. A purveyor of fiction. His mind was his tool, but it was also a notorious liar, prone to exaggeration and flights of fancy. He was isolated, sleep-deprived, and in a strange new environment. Of course his imagination was running wild. The knocking was the house settling, or a pine cone falling from a branch onto the roof, and the sound echoing strangely. It was a perfectly rational, explainable phenomenon. He felt a wave of relief at this thought, a foolishness for his midnight terror. He was just pouring his first cup of coffee when a heavy knock sounded at the door. This time it was solid, human. Alex jumped, sloshing hot coffee over his hand. Cursing, he ran it under cold water before peering through the peephole. It was me, my figure a dark silhouette against the brilliant snow, my breath a cloud of vapor in the frigid air. He opened the door, forcing a smile that felt brittle. "Morning, Jack." "A Mr. Henderson." I greeted him, my eyes scanning his face. I am sure I noticed the dark circles under his eyes, the slight tremor in his hand. "I trust you had a restful night." The question was innocuous, standard procedure, but to Alex, it felt like an accusation. "Fine, yeah, great." The quiet is really something. "It takes some getting used to," I said, my gaze drifting past him to the interior of the cabin. "The mountain is loudest when it's silent. You learn to listen to what it isn't saying." I gave a curt nod toward the back porch. "Remember to get your offering out before sunset. The forecast says the sky will be clear again tonight. Think things are more active on clear nights." The word things hung in the air between us, undefined and heavy with implication. He wanted to ask, to demand what I meant, but he couldn't bring himself to voice the question. To do so would be to admit that he believed that the terror of the previous night was more than just his imagination. He would be admitting that he was one of those nervous city folk he'd so casually dismissed. "Right, the trash. Got it?" he mumbled instead. I gave him a final, unreadable look and turned to leave. "Enjoy the words," I said over my shoulder, and then I was gone, my snowshoes leaving a neat, deliberate trail back toward my own cabin. Alex closed the door, his heart pounding again. Things are more active on clear nights. The phrase echoed in his mind, stripping away the rationalizations he had so carefully constructed. My visit had not been reassuring. It had been the opposite. It was a confirmation. I knew what was out here, and my rules were not a quirky welcome packet. They were a shield he had already damaged. He tried to work, but the words wouldn't come. The blank page on his laptop screen seemed to mock him. The silence in the cabin was no longer a peaceful canvas for his thoughts. It was a presence, vast and suffocating. Every creak of the timber, every sigh of the wind in the eaves, was a potential threat. He found himself glancing at the laminated card on the mantelpiece again and again, reading the rules until the ink seemed to blur. He was a prisoner to them now. He felt a desperate, clawing need to follow them to the letter. As the day wore on, the sun began its descent, painting the snow outside in hues of orange and pink. The beauty was lost on him. All he could think about was the approaching dusk. He meticulously gathered his organic waste for the day: coffee grounds, an apple core, the rind from a piece of cheese, and placed it in a small bag. The act felt absurd, a primitive ritual, but he performed it with the gravity of a sacrament. He opened the back door, just as the sun touched the horizon, the air instantly biting at his exposed skin. The cast iron box sat on the porch, squat and black against the snow. He quickly placed the bag inside, the metallic clang of the lid echoing in the twilight stillness. As he secured the latch, he scanned the tree line. The pines stood like silent, hooded figures, their shadows stretching long and distorted across the snow. He thought he saw a flicker of movement deep within the woods, a patch of darkness that seemed to shift and coalesce, but when he blinked, it was gone. He scrambled back inside, bolting the door behind him, his breath coming in ragged bursts. The cabin grew dark quickly. He drew every curtain, checking each one twice to ensure there were no gaps. He ate a joyless meal of canned soup, the silence broken only by the scraping of his spoon against the bowl. He felt a growing paranoia, a sense that the cabin was no longer a sanctuary, but a cage, and he was the bait. Later, he went into the bathroom to brush his teeth. The face that stared back at him from the mirror was pale and drawn, the eyes wide with a fear he could no longer deny. He remembered the fourth rule: mirror discipline. After dusk has fallen, you must not gaze at your own reflection for more than 60 seconds. He spat the toothpaste into the sink, his eyes still locked on his reflection. Why? What could possibly happen? It was the most ridiculous rule of all. A trick of the mind, that's all it could be. Altitude sickness, just as the card said. He was a rational man. He would prove it to himself. He would look for exactly 61 seconds and nothing would happen. He stared, his heart beginning to thud a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. 10 seconds. His reflection stared back, unblinking. 20 seconds. The fluorescent light above the sink seemed to hum with an unnatural intensity. 30 seconds. Was it a trick of the light, or did the shadows around his eyes seem deeper, darker? 40 seconds. He felt a wave of dizziness, a slight vertigo that made the room seem to tilt. Altitude sickness, he told himself. That's all it is. 50 seconds. He leaned closer, his breath fogging the glass, and then he saw it. It was infinitesimal, a detail so small he would have missed it if he weren't staring with such desperate intensity. His reflection smiled. It was not his smile. It was a wide, predatory baring of the teeth, a grotesque parody of a human expression that did not touch the eyes. The eyes of his reflection were flat, ancient, and filled with a cold, knowing hunger. The smile lasted for less than a second, a flicker in the glass, but it was there. Alex cried out, stumbling backward, away from the mirror. He tripped over the bath mat and fell, scrambling away on his hands and knees like a terrified animal, his eyes screwed shut. He didn't want to see that face again, that thing wearing his face. He lay on the cold tile of the bathroom floor, hyperventilating, the logical, rational world he had built for himself shattering into a million pieces. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't his imagination. It wasn't altitude sickness. The rules were real. The danger was real. and something was no longer just knocking on the window. He had looked at it, and it had looked back. It was inside with him now. Terror has a texture. Alex learned this on the cold tile of the bathroom floor. It was smooth and unyielding, like the certainty of his own impending death. He lay there, for an unknown amount of time, curled into a fetal position, listening to the frantic drumming of his own heart. The image of that smile was burned onto the backs of his eyelids, a predatory grin that belonged to something ancient and utterly inhuman. He had invited it in. Not with a word, but with a look. He had broken the rule, and now the lock was broken, the door unhinged. He eventually forced himself to move, crawling out of the bathroom without looking back, keeping his eyes fixed on the floor. He felt its presence in the cabin now, a static charge in the air, a drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the fire dying in the hearth. The silence was no longer empty. It was occupied. Every shadow seemed to stretch and writhe in his peripheral vision, and the familiar, comforting creaks of the cabin settling were now the stealthy footsteps of an unseen roommate. He spent the rest of the night huddled in an armchair in the main room, a heavy blanket pulled over his head, facing the fireplace. He did not sleep. He listened. He heard things. A soft, dry scratching sound from the other side of the front door, like a single, long fingernail being dragged slowly across the wood. Later, a whisper, so faint he thought he'd imagined it, seeming to come from the chimney, a sibilant breath that almost sounded like his name. Lex. Daylight, when it finally came, offered no relief. The brilliant sun on the snow was an insult, a mockery of the profound darkness that had taken root inside the cabin and inside him. The world outside was pristine and beautiful, but the cabin had become a contaminated space. He now avoided any surface that could cast a reflection, the darkened screen of his laptop, the black glass of the oven door, even the large picture window that had so captivated him upon his arrival. He covered the bathroom mirror with a towel. He was a man trying to erase himself, to become invisible to the thing that was now hunting him in his own temporary home. He couldn't write. He couldn't eat. He paced the cabin like a caged animal, his mind a frantic loop of fear and regret. The rules. He had to follow the rules. It was the only thing that mattered. His survival depended on it. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, he prepared for the nightly ritual of the offering with the obsessive focus of a bomb disposal expert. He gathered the day's meager scraps, tea leaves, the crust of a piece of bread he'd forced himself to eat, the peel from an orange. He checked and rechecked the small plastic bag, ensuring everything was there. But his mind was fractured, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. While pacing earlier, agitated and restless, he had eaten a pear, and without thinking, had dropped the small, withered core into the pocket of his fleece-lined robe. It was a tiny oversight, a single, forgotten piece of refuse in a cabin filled with his mounting dread. He stepped onto the back porch, the cold air a physical blow. He didn't look at the tree line today. His eyes were fixed on the iron box. He fumbled with the latch, his fingers numb and clumsy, dropped the bag inside, and slammed the heavy lid shut. He secured the latch and practically fell back into the cabin, bolting the door and leaning against it, his chest heaving. He had done it. He had followed the rule. He was safe for another night. He was wrong. An hour after full darkness fell, the scratching at the door began again, but this time it was different. It was louder, more insistent. It wasn't the sound of a single nail, but of many, a frantic, desperate clawing that spoke of a terrible hunger. Alex retreated to his armchair, pulling the blanket tight around him, his eyes wide in the flickering firelight. Then came the whispers. They weren't coming from the chimney anymore. They were inside. A soft, dry rustling sound from the darkest corner of the room, followed by that same sibilant hiss. Ea, Lex hungry. His blood turned to ice. It could speak. He squeezed his eyes shut, his hands over his ears, but the sound was inside his head, a violation of the deepest kind. He began to rock back and forth, muttering the rules to himself like a prayer. Curtains closed. Ignore the knocks. No mirrors. Stay on the path. It was then that his hand, trembling in the pocket of his robe, brushed against something small and hard. He froze. Slowly, with a dawning horror that eclipsed everything he had felt before, he pulled it out. The pure core. He stared at it lying in the palm of his shaking hand. A forgotten scrap. An unpaid tithe. Never leave organic waste inside the cabin overnight. He had failed. The offering was incomplete. The contract was broken. As if in response to his realization, the clawing at the door stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse, thick with anticipation. He heard a new sound, a faint, metallic click from the front door. He watched, paralyzed, as the deadbolt, which he had thrown with his own 2 hands, began to slowly, impossibly, rotate. It turned with a series of agonizingly slow clicks, each one a hammer blow to his sanity. Click, click. The bolt slid free. The doorknob began to turn. That was what broke him. The cabin was not a sanctuary, it was a trap, and the door was about to open. His mind, screaming for an escape, seized on the only option left. Me. He had to get to my cabin. It was his only hope. He scrambled to his feet, his eyes darting to the window. Outside, the moon cast its cold, blue light on a sea of untouched snow. The path, the one absolute, inviolable rule, was completely gone, buried under 4 feet of powder. To reach me, he would have to break the final rule. He would have to leave the path. The choice was no choice at all. A potential death in the snow was better than the certain damnation waiting for him on the other side of the door. He grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace, his only weapon against the unknown. The doorknob stopped turning. A profound silence fell over the cabin, a held breath before the final lunge. He didn't wait to see what would happen next. He ran to the back door, the one he had used for the offering, and fumbled with the bolt. He threw it open and plunged out into the night, the frigid air searing his lungs. He stood on the porch for a second, his eyes adjusting to the stark, monochromatic landscape. And then he saw it. It was standing at the edge of the woods, precisely where the path to my cabin would have been. It was not a man. It was too tall, too thin, its limbs elongated to an unnatural degree, like a tree that had learned to walk. It was a figure of pure blackness, a hole in the moonlit world. It was utterly still, a statue of patient malice. It wasn't trying to get into the cabin anymore. It was waiting for him. It had known he would run. For a single, lucid moment, Alex was caught between 2 impossibilities. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open, releasing a wave of cold that was not of the mountain, a palpable aura of ancient hunger and decay. Before him, the thing at the tree line stood impossibly still, a silhouette that drank the moonlight and gave nothing back. It was a choice between the teeth in the trap and the teeth in the woods. He chose the woods. He launched himself off the porch, the iron poker held in a white, knuckled grip. The snow was a physical shock, deeper and colder than he could have imagined. It swallowed him to his thighs, each step a desperate, lung-burning struggle. He was a city man, soft and unprepared, and the mountain was an indifferent killer. He glanced over his shoulder. The tall, dark figure had not moved, but he felt its attention on him, a cold pressure against the back of his neck. He pushed forward, his only thought to reach the distant, faint light of my cabin. This was the final rule, the one he had been warned against breaking Under any circumstances, the path is absolute. The laminated card had provided a rational reason: treacherous terrain, hidden crevices. The reality was infinitely worse. The path was not just a cleared trail, it was an agreement, a line of truce, and he had just stepped over it. He had gone maybe 50 yards when the figure began to move. It did not run. It did not walk. It seemed to glide over the surface of the snow, its unnatural limbs carrying it with a fluid, horrifying grace. It was not hindered by the deep powder that was slowly killing him. It belonged here. He did not. Panic gave him a surge of adrenaline. He flailed through the snow, his breath sobbing in his throat. The cold was a living entity, seeping through his clothes, stealing the warmth from his blood, the strength from his muscles. His mind, starved of oxygen and flooded with terror, began to fracture. The whispering started again, no longer from the cabin, but from the sighing pines all around him. The snow-laden branches took on the shapes of grasping, skeletal hands. The pristine, moonlit beauty of the landscape became a monstrous canvas of shifting shadows and imagined threats. He stumbled, his foot catching on something buried beneath the snow. He fell hard, his face plunging into the icy powder. The iron poker flew from his numb fingers, disappearing into the white. He tried to push himself up, but his limbs were heavy, unresponsive. Hypothermia was setting in, a slow, insidious death. He rolled onto his back, gasping, his heart hammering a frantic, failing rhythm. The figure was closer now, looming over him. It was only 20 feet away, and for the first time, he could see it was not just a shadow. It had a form, a texture like charred bark, and a shape that was a blasphemous mockery of the human frame. It had no face, only a smooth, dark expanse where features should have been. It raised one of its long, spindly arms, and the air grew colder still. It was then that a new light appeared. A steady, golden glow, cutting through the sterile blue of the moonlight. It came from my cabin. I was walking toward them, holding an old, brass-paned lantern. The light it cast was warm, alive. The figure stopped. It turned its featureless head toward me, a gesture of pure curiosity. It seemed to shrink away from the lantern's glow, a subtle recoil, as if the warmth were anathema to it. I did not run. I walked with a steady, deliberate pace, my snowshoes crunching on the crust of the snow. I stopped a few yards from Alex, placing myself between him and the creature. I said nothing. I simply held the lantern aloft. Inside, it was not a simple flame, but a piece of glowing, amber-colored resin, emitting a faint, aromatic smoke. The creature stood its ground for a long moment, a standoff in the silent, frozen theater of the mountains. Then, with a movement so slow it was almost imperceptible, it lowered its arm. It gave one last, long look at the shivering man half buried in the snow, then turned and dissolved back into the deep shadows of the pines, leaving no tracks. I lowered the lantern and looked down at Alex. His eyes were wide with a terror that had burned past screaming. His lips were blue. "You broke the rules," I said. It was not an accusation, but a simple statement of fact. I hauled him to his feet and half dragged, half carried him back to my cabin. It was small, Spartan, smelling of wood smoke, pine resin, and something else. A dry herbal scent. I sat him in a chair by the crackling stove, wrapped him in heavy wool blankets, and forced a mug of hot, bitter tea into his trembling hands. He drank it mechanically, his eyes still fixed on the darkness outside the window. He was silent for a long time, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the chattering of his own teeth. Finally, he spoke, his voice a raw whisper. What was that?" I stoked the fire, my back to him. "It has no name that you would understand. It is the mountain, or a part of it, the oldest part. The rules," he stammered. "The laminated card, The reasons on the card are for people like you, I said, turning to face him. Plausible lies to make the impossible seem manageable. The real reasons are more complicated. I picked up my own worn copy of the rules from my mantelpiece. Rule 1: the curfew of the senses. It's not about respecting wildlife. It's about not being seen. The night belongs to it. When you look out into its world, you issue an invitation for it to look into yours. The knocks, he breathed. Rule 3: the silence of 3. The wind doesn't knock. That is a question it asks. Are you alone? May I enter? By ignoring it, you refuse the invitation. But you had already opened the curtain. You had already let it see you. The mirror. Rule 4: mirror discipline. Reflections are like water. Still surfaces. It can move through them. When you stared, you held a door open for it. You saw it smile because it was already on the other side, looking back at you. He shuddered violently, pulling the blanket tighter. The offering. The pure core I forgot. Rule 2: the offering. That is the most important rule. It is not a suggestion to prevent scavengers. It is a tithe, a payment, acknowledgement of its sovereignty here. You are a guest in its house, and you must pay rent. You came up short. It came to collect. Alex stared into the fire, his face a mask of dawning, soul-crushing comprehension. And the path, I left the path. Yes, I said, my voice low. Rule 5. The path is absolute. The path is a truce. A line drawn in the snow. On it, you are a visitor, and you are tolerated, so long as the other rules are followed. The moment you stepped off it, you were no longer a visitor. You were a trespasser. And it does not suffer trespassers gladly. We sat in silence for the rest of the night. 2 days later, the sun had worked on the snow enough that I could clear the road with my plow. Alex packed his bags in a numb, silent haste. The man who left was not the man who had arrived. The desperate writer seeking inspiration was gone, replaced by a haunted man who had looked into an abyss and found something looking back. His eyes were old, and he flinched at shadows. His novel would never be finished. I watched his sensible all-wheel-drive vehicle disappear down the winding road, the last trace of him erased by the indifferent landscape. I walked back to the main cabin. It was cold and silent, holding no memory of the terror that had unfolded within its walls. I cleaned it meticulously, changing the linens, sweeping the floors, and wiping down every surface. From the heavy oak desk, I took out a fresh, laminated card. I placed it in the center of the desk, ready for the next guest. Outside, the sun shone on the magnificent, snow-covered peaks. The mountains were beautiful, they were silent, and they were waiting.